Uh, Thank you for coming today. My name is Araceli Tinajero. I am professor of Hispanic literatures here at the Graduate Center and at the City College of New York. On behalf of the Bildner Center, welcome to today's panel, Fidel, Post-Fidel, Legacy and Change. It is my pleasure to introduce Anthony DePalma, who spent more than 20 years as a reporter and correspondent for the New York Times. Today, Anthony DePalma will talk about Fidel's legacy and assessing Trump's reality. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Araceli. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And as always, I want to give my thanks to the Bildner Center, which has been very supportive to me over the years in all of my projects, especially to El Profe. And I want to thank all of you for coming on such a lousy day. It's been raining so much that some of the scenes that I saw as I was coming through the Meadowlands from New Jersey look like the scenes coming from the Malecón in the last 2 days, where they really are getting inundated. This should be a discussion when you talk about Fidel's legacy and what's going to happen. Because really none of it is settled, and I'm sure everyone has an opinion or a point of view. This latest phrase of alternative facts could certainly have applied to anything involved with Fidel or Cuba over the years. So what I'm going to try to do is just sort of set out some points that we can talk about afterwards, because I'm sure everybody will have an opinion, and I'm sure that you won't all agree with everything that I say, and that's fine. Since this panel intends to look at two gigantic personalities, right, Fidel Castro and Donald Trump, as well as Cuba with one and without the other, I thought it would be best to begin at a point where the two of them overlapped. In the early hours after Fidel's death on November 25th, Donald J. Trump, the president-elect, tweeted the one statement, and I took notice of it, it was the one statement about Fidel out of all of the millions of words that have been written about him, including quite a few of my own in the obituary that ran in the New York Times. What he tweeted contained the 4 words that are among the few about Fidel that are unassailably true.
Trump said something true?
Yes, right? Fidel Castro is dead. That much we know. And that in itself is something I can tell you, having written the first draft of the obituary 16 years ago, and then having to update it all those years and all those times, and especially after 2006, 2008, when there were regular eruptions of rumors about Fidel dying, and we'd have to rush and get everything ready to go. This in itself is sort of an accomplishment of a statement of fact. Of course, hours later, Trump put out a statement along the lines of many that would come out in the days and weeks that followed November 25th. What he said was, "Today the world marks the passing of a brutal dictator who oppressed his own people for nearly 6 decades. Fidel Castro's legacy," so here he was setting it up for us, right? We're talking about the legacy. "Fidel Castro's legacy is one of firing squads." Well, there were. "Theft." I mean, every time I go to Cuba, every Cuban tells me we are all criminals. We all have to steal in order to survive. "Unimaginable suffering." People would agree with that. "Poverty and the denial of fundamental human rights. While Cuba remains a totalitarian island, it is my hope," said Trump, "that today marks a move away from the horrors endured for too long and toward a future in which the wonderful Cuban people finally live in the freedom they so richly deserve." And there were many, millions of people who agreed with that. There were opinions all over the world that didn't necessarily agree with those statements. Let's say Raza Rabbani the chairman of the Pakistani Senate, over here on the right, called Fidel Castro a role model of change for the world. The three leading lessons of Fidel Castro's principles, he said, include resilience against superpower, yes, safeguarding national interest, yes, and welfare of the masses, depending how you see it, yes. He added that Castro gave the strength to his people, making them face challenges courageously. Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, said Castro is one of the most iconic personalities of the 20th century. India mourns the loss of a great friend. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada, there were rumors also that he was Fidel's son. And they said put pictures next to each other, but you know, alternative fact. He actually was in Cuba in November, but did not meet Castro then. Said he received the news of Castro's death with sadness and called the revolutionary leader a longtime friend of Canada and of my family, and got into a lot of hot water among the opposition in Canada for that. There was also lots of condemnation, Miami included, but let's say the Amnesty International said in a statement over more than 5 decades documenting the state of human rights in Cuba, Amnesty has recorded a relentless campaign against those who dare to speak out against the Cuban government's policies and practices. And Human Rights Watch, its director of the Americas program, Jose Miguel Vironco, said, even if Castro no longer calls the shots, the repressive machinery he constructed over almost half a century remains fully intact. I was in Cuba in December, just a week after the funeral. Many there, voiced all kinds of opinions. Havana filmmaker Rebecca Chavez, like many, defended Castro, under whom she'd lived practically her whole life. She said, you can believe or think of Fidel what you want, which is absolutely the truth. But what nobody can deny is that he is the most important figure of 20th century Cuba and a very, very important figure in Latin America. Undoubtedly, that's true. But in death, as in life, Castro defies categorization. His place in history is secure. His legacy is not. In large measure because there's not now, nor will there ever be, I don't think, any consensus about any aspect of his life or work that is as definitive as Trump's tweet about his death. Castro's life has been surrounded by so much myth, much of it his own making, that passions often cloud reason and hinder the ability of people to assess the reality of the Cuba he created. From the very beginning of his career as a rebel, Castro was a master of myth. That's the Granma, which they pulled out again. They postponed the celebration this year because of his death, but they held it anyway. He took the humiliating failure of the Moncada attack and converted it into the founding archetype of his revolution, 26th of July. In the Sierra, with a ragtag army and a few hunting rifles, he boasted to American reporters, including a reporter for the New York Times, that he would soon defeat Batista's army and restore constitutional democracy to Cuba, claiming no power for himself and no animosity toward the United States. After Batista fled, Castro took over, and in just a few months toured victoriously toward the United States, assuring everyone here that there was absolutely nothing about his revolution that even hinted of communism. He even met with then Vice President Richard Nixon for over 2 hours in Washington. Nixon's impression of Castro was mixed. He wrote in a summary of the meeting, which we now have in the record, quote, "The one fact that we can be sure of about Fidel is that he has those indefinable qualities which make him a leader of men. He's either incredibly naive about communism or under communist discipline? My guess, said Nixon, is the former, naive about communism. And as I have already implied, his ideas as to how to run a government or an economy are less developed than those of almost any world figure I have met. It's essential to look at Fidel when assessing his legacy, not just how he seized power, but how he governed for a half century. About the former, there is no doubt. As the leader of a small guerrilla army, he achieved an unlikely victory. But governing is never the strong point of an ideologue. It's clear from Havana today how those two aspects of his legacy are to be recorded in history. In December, when I was there, this is the Plaza of the Revolution. Draped over the side of the National Library is this photograph, one of the earliest ones of Fidel as the rebel leader. Now, they could have put any photograph they wanted. This is the one they chose. So you have to look at it for the significance of why they chose this one. The photograph is actually taken from a vantage point below Fidel, so he's actually taller than anything around him. And this is probably five stories or 6 stories tall. But in the photograph, he's taller than anything, including the mountains, the Sierra. And he is utterly alone. At the time the photograph was taken, he and his uprising were all possibility and promise. But within a relatively short time, he forced Batista to flee, leaving the presidency and the country essentially open and unguarded, which allowed the rebels to roll into the capital without firing a shot. In Cuba, they chose to remember him that way officially and across the country. I went to El Guerrillero newspaper, which is the official and only newspaper in the province of Pinar del Rio, and this was their special obituary issue. Since I had spent 16 years on mine, and we were among journalists, I asked a professional question about how long they had taken to prepare their special obituary issue. And I asked the editor here, Ernesto Osorio, about that, and he said proudly, nothing. No preparation. None whatsoever. They found out about his death when it appeared on television on Friday night. He said, we didn't have to. You don't have to when it comes from the heart. If I was still at the paper, I might try that, but I don't know how far I would get. I suspect not very far. Then I went over to Granma, right, which is the official Communist Party organ, the official newspaper, news organization in Cuba, and about the only national news operation. Karina Marron is the deputy subdirectora of the paper. She basically said the same thing. They had done no preparation in advance. Of course, it's the official policy of the party that his legacy is settled. There's no need to really bring it up. Everybody knows what's self-evident doesn't need to be in the paper. So then I asked her if after Fidel's death, she expected Cuba to more fully embrace the reforms that Raul had put forward, right? That we knew that Fidel was somewhat opposed to, or would they double down on Fidel's hardline ideology? Now, she's only 32 years old, so I thought, and a professional journalist who understands podcasts and the internet and lots of other modern concepts. She's lived her whole life under Fidel, so I thought I might get an honest answer. But it was the party line, and the party line was that before Fidel's death, yes, they had observed that there were some changes taking place in Cuban society as the cuentapropistas were allowed in, as there was money allowed in, that Cubans had started to think more about themselves than about the society as a whole. But that Fidel's funeral, the 4 days that it took to drag that urn across the country with people lining up, proved that, in fact, that was just a passing phase and that, in fact, people were coming together again under the same sense of a socialist society that Fidel had put forward. That's the official line. That is where Granma and the party are going, bringing people back together. Castro mastered social media long before the internet was invented. He understood keenly the power of image and word and remained engaged in La Batalla de Ideas right to the end of his long life. He was able to convince millions of Cubans who were forced to live on food scraps during the special period and rationing in state stores like this. That was December. That was not staged. That was the store in this particular community, and that's what was available. Nothing. Crackers, a bag of crackers for 25 Cuban pesos, right? Not much, about a quarter, and a bottle of rum. Bread and some lard and maybe a few eggs on the other side. He convinced them that their sacrifice was necessary for the defense of the motherland. He convinced Cuban people that they enjoyed the best, that they were blessed with a free education, one of the school kids, even if whatever he ends up earning as a degree later on when he goes off to university will be essentially useless, as there are very few skilled jobs for them. He'll get a degree in engineering and he will hope to become a taxi driver or a waiter. Fidel convinced them that they enjoyed the best health system in the world. And this is, again, an unrehearsed, candid shot of a local clinic. Those are the conditions that you see, and this is their medicine storage cabinet, which was basically empty. In December, I was with a group. One of the group travelers got sick, so we had to experience the health system firsthand. We were in Pinar del Rio, in Viñales, and we had to take him to the international clinic there. He had a stomach ailment. We weren't sure exactly what it was. They kept him there for a few hours. We had to go on to the next meeting at the newspaper, and then checked on him at the hospital in Pinar del Rio because the clinic said he needed to go to the hospital for extra treatment. We got to the hospital and couldn't find him because even though it was 2.5 hours later, the ambulance hadn't arrived. He stayed overnight in the international section of the hospital, 3rd floor, best of the best, and was put on a gurney like this. This one has sheets. His didn't. No sheets, no blankets, no pillows. A toilet in the room that had no toilet seat, no toilet paper, and no water. He was never tagged, so nobody knew exactly who he was for the day that he stayed. He had to stay overnight. We had to pay a nurse to watch him. And the X-ray machine and the EKG machine were leftovers from the early 1960s. And they charged him about $500. Wasn't free for him. We were lucky that they said he needed surgery, but I think once he saw the conditions, he rallied enough to make it back to Miami. We did not bring him in for surgery. Fidel preached about the equality of all Cubans under the socialist society, right? We are all equal. And he declared in the 1960s that racism had been banished and Cuba was colorblind, making complaining about racism counter-revolutionary. So you couldn't do it. But today, talk to any black Cuban, and there are far more than the 35% of the population that the census officially says are black. In part, a reflection of the society's sentiments about color, because you are self-identified, and mestizos, which make up the majority of the population, tend to consider themselves not black but white for the obvious reasons. Talk to any black Cuban today, like these two, and they will tell you that that is another one of Castro's myths. Go to any paladar, and count the number of black waiters, and there'll be very few. Look at the government's highest echelons and count the number of black officials, and there will be very few. And during his long time in office, Fidel never allowed blacks to join together to form a group to fight openly for equal rights, as they had before 1912, the Independent Party of Color, which was put down by the government in 1912, and there's never been a national organization allowed like it. I met Gloria Rolando, a Cuban filmmaker who has it was the week of the Cuban Film Festival. So she had released this film, Breaking the Silence, about the massacre in 1912. They basically rounded up people and got rid of them, and that was the end of the party. Fidel's record, his legacy on human rights is horrible. In the 2 years since December 2014, when Raul and Obama made their announcement about restarting diplomatic relations, the number of temporary detentions of human rights activists and dissidents has actually increased. According to the Cuban Commission for Human Rights and National Reconciliation, Cuban security forces detained more than 8,600 people last year. The number actually spiked during Obama's trip to Cuba while he was in Cuba. State security summarily rounded up potential protesters and parked security officers in front of houses of other suspected opposition people, they call them agitators, to prevent them from staging a demonstration. As I'm sure all of you know, there's only one party, there is only one press, there's no free press there. And for most of the time that Fidel was the unquestioned leader, he convinced Cubans that the difficulties in their daily lives was the fault of American imperialists. Even after he had handed over power to Raul in 2006 temporarily, 2008 permanently, and Raul agreed to the historic thaw with the United States, Fidel refused to turn a page on the past. Through all that, the Cuban people have been incredibly patient and resistant, with an unparalleled ability to improvise ways to live in their impoverished country. A number of years ago, when I was doing research for The Man Who Invented Fidel, my driver had a flat as we were driving across the country. We needed to get off the highway right away. He changed the flat, but we weren't going to go very far without a spare tire. So we were looking for a place that would repair spares, and we found one on the side of the road, he had set up his taller, his shop, on the back of, inside the back of a school bus that had been chopped off the wheel, so it was just like a little hut. And he used improvised tools, including, the most amazing of them, he was vulcanizing the tire. So he had to take it off, scrape it, use some rubber. He took a patch made up from a bicycle tube, put it on there, and then the process, and I know this when I was in college, I did vulcanize tires, you have to apply pressure and electricity to heat it up. Well, that wasn't going to happen. So when he was ready for that stage, he turned around and he said, "Maria!" And his wife came from the house carrying a tray, and on the tray was the piston of an automobile engine, which is round and, like with a point sticking up, that she'd taken out of the oven that was hot. He put it on the patch, applied a vise, and we were on our way. Fantastic. This trip, my improvised story was a Cuban Harley Davidson. So when the gas tank corrodes and needs to be replaced, soda or water bottle will do. Wouldn't pass inspection here, but it got him where he was going. Every almendron on the street is this kind of Frankenstein. I will always ask them to open up the hood, and underneath the hood of that 57 Chevy is a Toyota engine with a Hyundai battery and something else and something else and something else. It's quite incredible. And it explains why among the 201 jobs that Raul allows is spark plug cleaner and tester. Because you cannot get them, so you reuse the ones that you've had before. One of the fundamental inevitabilities in assessing the legacy of Fidel Castro is the realization that you come upon eventually that had Fidel stepped down in 1969 after 10 years of the revolution, he would be remembered not only as a heroic rebel leader, but for having ushered in dramatic changes that benefited many of the poor and isolated Cubans in the countryside in Cuba in 1969. Had he stepped down in 1989, he would be remembered for establishing systems of healthcare and education that a small Caribbean country could never have afforded, because he did it with money from the Soviet Union. But it wasn't until 2008 that he stepped aside permanently to allow Raul to take over. And now, I believe he will be known for running the Cuban economy into the ground, undermining the foundations of the education and healthcare system that he established at such great sacrifice, and unnecessarily prolonging the antagonism with the United States that has been so costly for the Cuban people. Hasta siempre, but I'm afraid that it will always be remembered that way. In April of last year, President Obama made the historic trip to Cuba. That could not have been possible.
March.
March. I was there in April, right afterwards. That could not have been possible with Fidel still in charge. In fact, it would not have been possible without Obama in charge here as well. The impact of that realignment from December 2014, you can see it pretty clearly in Havana. You know, they've now capped the number of paladares at 500 in Havana. There are so many of them. This is, if you know the central Havana, this is at the end of the Prado, right by the Malecon. This facade has been standing there with scaffolding for who knows how long. This was in June of last year, and in December, it's now well on the way to becoming a hotel, tourist hotel. We stayed at the Parque Central, and within a 5-minute walk of the hotel, there is this and 4 other hotels underway. This is the Manzana Gomez, right across the street, the entire block being done as a hotel. It's really quite beautiful now. This is on the Prado, another small hotel. This is down the street on the Prado, another small hotel, all in December. I couldn't get down to this last one right on the corner of the Malecon and the Prado on the other side from that hotel. Over here, you can't really see because it's not yet out of the ground, but they were excavating for construction of yet another hotel. All of them within just a few blocks, not to mention the Inglaterra, which is being renovated by Westwood. The rates at the Parque Central have practically doubled, over $600 a night. It was well occupied, but not full. I think people are starting to react a little bit negatively to the price hike. The Cubans thought they could just charge anything, and I think maybe they've sort of reached the limit of elasticity, at least for now. Although the hotel was a little reluctant to celebrate because this was just a week after the funeral, by the end of the week, it was Christmas. While I was there, this behemoth was parked or docked in the harbor. I was lucky enough not to be there when it disgorged the 3,000 passengers, but the people I spoke to said it's pretty horrible when they all come down and they are making their way through the crowded streets of Havana Vieja, not going into any of the restaurants because they've already paid for food on board, just sort of gawking and looking for a bathroom. And not buying much. And when the ship leaves, they leave a mountain of trash that needs to be cleaned up. It's amazing. First time I went to Cuba was in 1979. It took like 3 months of negotiations, and we had to get a visa from the Czechoslovakian embassy to get there. Now at the airport in Miami, it's as easy as going to Barbados or anywhere else. Just you want to go? Here. And the fares are incredibly, incredibly low for as long as they will last. The Obama, over 600,000 Americans went to Cuba last year. The majority of them were Cuban Americans, but lots of others as well. The Obama administration has promised that trade with Cuba could reach up to $6 billion a year under its new policies, but in fact, the latest figures that I saw, U.S. companies had exported barely $400 million worth of goods to the island since December 2014. All of those changes are now at stake with the transition to Trump. Cubans, the reality is that Cubans in Florida were about the only Latino group that came out in large enough numbers for Trump to notice. Cubans in Florida were about twice as likely as non-Cuban voters in Florida Latino voters, to go for Trump. So that means he feels he owes them. But we should be clear talking about what's likely to happen, because Cuba is not Mexico. All right, so he didn't promise to build a wall around Cuba. He didn't promise to deport millions of Cubans. He didn't make a promise to rip up a trade agreement like NAFTA, although he has this idea that there is a deal. There isn't a single deal. There are lots of different contracts and negotiations that he would have to go through. He's contradicted himself on Cuba, saying during the early part of the campaign that the concept of opening up with Cuba is fine. As a businessman, I think it's fine, he said. Then a month later, threatening to scrap the opening with Cuba if Havana failed to embrace religious and political freedoms. Vice President Mike Pence said after the election, before they were inaugurated, when Donald Trump and I take to the White House, we will reverse Barack Obama's executive orders on Cuba. Obama sort of preempted them a couple of weeks ago by shutting down wet foot, dry foot at the spur of the moment, leaving hundreds, if not thousands, of Cubans in Mexico or on their way to the Mexican border. Now we understand that they're still there hunkering down, hoping that Trump will change his mind about that and allow them in. When questioned specifically about wet foot, dry foot, Trump, in early 2016, during the campaign, said, "I don't think that's fair. I mean, why would that be a fair thing?" But in August, after the numbers in Florida started to change, he told the Miami Herald that he hadn't made a decision about whether to discontinue the policy. Now that the decision has been made by former President Obama, the question is whether Trump will undo it. It's hard to predict, but you can be sure many Cubans are praying that he does. Can everything that the Obama administration has done since 2009 to improve relations with Cuba be undone by this administration? The short answer is yes. All of the changes, starting in 2009 with lifting the limits on Cuban American travel to the island, which was of particular interest to me. My wife is Cuban. We still have family there, and it made it easier to go back. Through the loosening of restrictions on the import of cigars and rum, unlimited amount you could bring back on my last trip in December. And if any of you are going now, take advantage of it before that changes. They've all been done through presidential action, and they can be done just as easily as he canceled the Pacific trade agreement and today put Keystone Pipeline back in business. Just as easy. I was always asked about the embargo being lifted under Congress, in the past Congress. Under this Congress, well, that's not an issue any longer. The issue is what can be done. There are 6 Cuban-American members of Congress who have a chokehold on Cuba issues. They are Senators Rubio and Menendez, and in the House, Albio Sires, New Jersey, Mario Diaz-Balart, and Ileana Ross-Lehtinen of Florida, and Carlos Curbelo. They have all basically dedicated themselves to getting revenge on the Castro regime, the businesses. So Obama's strategy seems to have been giving U.S. businesses like Google, that's down there, and other businesses in agriculture and hospitality, giving them enough stake in Cuba being open that they would raise their voices and make it difficult for a new administration to roll back this opening. In retrospect, that strategy looks foolish, maybe even naive. Although lots of American companies have cut deals with Castro's government, and American Airlines, Delta, JetBlue have all established daily flights, the Cubans on their side have been, as Richard Feinberg told us in December here, have been achingly slow in moving forward in the propositions that have been put forward over the last 2 years. They've approved very few deals, and Feinberg gave a pretty good answer why Cuban officials wouldn't want to do that. They wouldn't want to be seen as going too far in that direction. Businesses, American businesses now just don't have enough invested in Cuba to really raise the kind of objections that would be needed to prevent the new administration from retightening the U.S. embargo. So what will Trump's relationship be with Cuba, and how will that affect the U.S. relationship with Latin America? It's important to remember that Cuba, for much of the last few decades, has been our way, the U.S. way of dealing with Latin America. As long as Cuba was a stumbling block, our relations with Latin America soured. Summit of the Americas and all other kinds of issues became heightened as long as Cuba was left out. Once they were allowed in at the summit and in a lesser way through the OAS, things started to improve. What happens now? See, now, they could have put this picture on the side of the building. Right? That would have given a different message, but they didn't. Right? The truth is, no one in Latin America today comes close to replacing Fidel or assuming his role as patron among the nations of the continent. Jose Acel of the University of Miami said, since 1959, Fidel Castro has been not only an inspiration to Latin America's left, but its de facto continental leader. With Fidel's death, the Latin American left has lost its champion. And with the failure and utter chaos of his economic model, which Fidel said in 2010 doesn't even work for Cuba anymore, they have lost their common strategic goal of moving more towards the left and a socialist economy. Acel and other academics argue that the departure of Fidel and the loss of his guidance and the collapse of his economy actually can provide a vacuum into which, it could be a good thing for the United States, providing a vacuum into which the United States can move to repair and improve its relationship with all of Latin America. It will be up to Trump and his administration of business leaders to realize the opportunity and offer an alternative economic path, one that would address immigration issues, keep China, Russia, and other states out of the hemisphere, and provide new markets. Some argue that Obama, and in fact Raul, were too hesitant. They moved too slowly to set their changes in stone, assuming, as they did, that Hillary would be president now and would be able to complete what they had started. Raul, for his part, wasn't in much of a hurry to give up too much, assuming that he could wait to see how he could negotiate with Hillary. He did not see Trump. There are other things standing in the way. If you recognize this person, New Jersey State Trooper Werner Foster. In 1973, he was killed in a shootout on a highway, Interstate 80 in New Jersey. Joanne Chesimard, a member of the BLA, Black Liberation Army, right, was convicted of the murder. She was held in a New Jersey prison and escaped. The Christie administration, along with the New Jersey State Police and a whole lot of other police groups and political figures in New Jersey and across the nation, have made the return of Chesimard and other fugitives a priority. Menendez joined them, and Trump hasn't addressed it directly, but we can imagine on what side of that issue he would fall. There's Joanne. Now, what's her name now? Asada Shakur. Yeah. Rex Tillerson, Secretary of State designate, said in his hearings that he would advise the president to veto any legislation codifying Obama's thaw with Cuba, at least until they can conduct their own review. He said the decision to lift the designation as a state sponsor of terror ought to be revisited. He told the panel that Cuba has not done enough to protect human rights since August and the reestablishment of diplomatic relations. Quote, "We must adhere to standards of accountability." He said, "Our recent engagement with the government of Cuba was not accompanied by any significant concessions on human rights. We have not held them accountable for their conduct. Their leaders received much, while their people received little. That serves neither the interest of Cubans nor Americans." If confirmed, he will engage with Cuba. Will he actually name an ambassador? Will there be an ambassador? There's no ambassador now. There hasn't been an ambassador since we reestablished relations. What happens? We don't know. He will engage with Cuba, but continue to press for reform, support human rights defenders and democracy activists, empower civil society, defend freedom, and promote improved internet access. And ask our allies to do the same, which they haven't done for decades. We've been out there on our own. The Trump transition team has brought some people on board that we are not sure of what they'll do, but we know what they have done. Many of you may know this guy, Mauricio Claver Caron. He is co-founder and director of the U.S.-Cuba Democracy Political Action Committee. They gave about $700,000 in the most recent elections, donated to Rubio, executive director of Cuba Democracy Advocates in Washington, basically the #1 lobbyist for keeping or strengthening the embargo. He's now on the transition team for the Department of Treasury. Let's see, they also got executive director of, Ileana Ross Leithanen's staffer, Yalim Poblete, is on the transition team. And just Sunday, again, figuring out where it goes, he named, Trump named and swore in Jason Greenblatt. Jason Greenblatt, a senior vice president for the Trump Organization, special representative for international negotiations, which includes the Israel-Palestine negotiations, trade deals like NAFTA, and Cuba. But we don't really know where Greenblatt stands because for the Trump administration, he went to Cuba in 2012 to look up business deals. And on his own websites, he's encouraged stronger relations with Cuba. So where will he go? We don't know. From the Cuban perspective, Bruno Rodriguez, the foreign minister, was very explicit about what Obama was up to. President Obama's trip to Cuba, he said, was at least in part a deep attack on our ideas, our history, our culture, and our symbols. Raul Castro continues to refer to the United States as the enemy, claiming the only U.S. methods have changed, not its goals. Something I heard repeated at Granma and at El Guerrillero. One thing that can be said about the Castros, they're not suicidal. They'll go along with changes as long as they can manage them to their benefit, and no more. They've allowed marketplace reforms, but they're intent on not losing control, And this was the message of the 7th Congress in April of last year, in which the opening was roundly denounced. If you argue that that Castro was a good rebel, but a bad governor, whose ideas of running the country were misguided at best, ruinous at worst, 2017 begins with Cuba minus both a leader and a viable economic strategy. One word you hear over and over and over again to describe Raul is tired. He's tired. Maricela was in New York just a couple of weeks ago, and she told a colleague that, yeah, my father is really tired. And he looks it. He doesn't seem to have much zeal anymore for governing, if he ever had. Instead of phrases like hasta la victoria siempre or patria o muerte, he closed the final meeting of the assembly at the end of last year with eso es todo. That was it. So, to sum up, Cuba must now begin the difficult process of life after Fidel. With his passing, the island will inevitably and eventually return to its actual size, a small Caribbean nation of 11 million people who will be forced to see the world in which they exist as it really is, not as it has been disguised for so many years by a master myth maker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony DePalma. Our next speaker is John McAuliff, who is the founder and executive director of the Fund for Reconciliation and Development. For the past 20 years, he has traveled to Cuba on behalf of normalization of relations with special attention to travel and academic exchange. The title of his photo commentary, he's going to show us some slides, is Eyewitness in the Mourning. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I've known Anthony since meeting him at one of these sessions, and our last encounter was in an airport going and coming. I think we go to the same country, but I'm not always sure that we describe it the same way. And actually, much to the horror of my family and most of my friends, I'm actually more optimistic about Trump than he is too. So I have more optimism on both sets of issues. And I want to, before going into the pictures, want to note two things about the Tillerson hearings. One was that what really seemed to be agitating Rubio and Menendez was getting Tillerson to promise that he would advise to Trump that he veto any legislation to lift the embargo or end travel restrictions. Now, I mean, legislation, they're assuming that there is legislation that could come through.
And pass.
And pass. And I think that's like everything else about Trump. It is totally unpredictable. It's not just Greenblatt, who is the cousin of Bob Greenblatt. Those of you who have an anti-war history would remember Bob's name. The person who is the deputy head of the National Security Council is a very conservative woman, but if you look online, you'll see the article that she wrote that said that it was very supportive of Obama because the U.S. really had to get in there and assure that the U.S. was the influential power, not China or Russia. So it's not that Trump will suddenly become a socialist, but the question is whether he will see the world in a different way that will lead to different conclusions. And in fact, if he does, he will be far more able to end travel restrictions and the embargo than Hillary Clinton could have. So we'll see where we are 6 months from now. The basic thing that Tillerson said was bottoms-up review. I like bottoms-up reviews. They take a long time to do. So don't worry about getting that trip in the next 2 weeks, because I think we can continue. So one of the wonderful gifts that President Obama gave us was spontaneity for engagement with Cuba. After Fidel Castro and Cuba have been part of my life, as everybody in my generation to some extent, but for me, since my senior year of high school in Indianapolis. So when he passed, I thought that would be interesting. I have many, many Cuban friends, and I wanted to go and actually get a sense of how people were feeling and thinking and emotioning and everything else about his death, not through either our media or their media, both of which obviously have a heavy bias in the way they spin things. If you watch the reaction to Fidel's death in most of the US media, it's like every horror story of the last 60 years, 55 years was resurrected to show why we despise this person, and it's just as well that he was gone. But Cuba's much more complicated. As I said, spontaneity. So I got on the first JetBlue flight to nonstop from New York to Havana. JetBlue's flights now are about $250 round trip. If you're not going to Cuba for a long weekend, you're missing an opportunity. Okay, so this is just several posters that you see in the Plaza de Armas, where all of the books and other things, and this is sort of in the moment of mourning. Basically what I wanted to be there was for the period of mourning, which was 9 days. I mean, it was something that, as people say, they may not have been preparing the obits, but they'd been preparing the mourning process ever since he became seriously ill. And so this is worth. This was a poster, a picture that had appeared in one of the newspapers and had been immediately made into a poster. This one I like too. The John Lennon and Che Guevara imagery. Okay, so I'm arriving 2 or 3 days after his passing, and there are two major events or processes that I'm able to observe. And again, I am not invited by anybody. I am not under anyone's supervision. I'm seeing Cubans that I've known for years, and I'm just off by myself doing things and talking to people with all kinds of backgrounds. One of the things I wanted to do was the mass event they did in Havana, which was like a political rally always is in Havana. It was focused on the speakers from abroad, the presidents of various countries that had come. The president of Ecuador was a real winner. The president of Venezuela was not so impressive, and Danny Ortega from Nicaragua was even less impressive to the Cubans that I knew, but the president of South Africa spoke. The head of the National Assembly in Vietnam spoke. So it was the Havana event in which this international sense of who Fidel was expressed. And these are some of the folks that were there. One has to be always conscious. First of all, it is a single-party state. It is a single-party press, but people have immense amount of access to other information and certainly other opinions. But still, as I say, it's a mourning process that had been in preparation for a decade, and it was orchestrated. The parallels that I was thinking of several times was when Lincoln died, when he was killed, and the procession of his body going back to Illinois, or when Roosevelt died. Both of those people were fundamental figures within our culture and history, and their passing, I think, looking at Fidel's passing from within that framework is helpful. There were certainly people who were at this event who had gone, organized groups, students or workplaces, but there are also just a lot of people who went. This was in the evening. It was, the Plaza of the Revolution and that big wide road that goes up the hill from Paseo, and that's my driver. I went with the guy who's been my driver for the last 7 or 8 years. He was the driver of Núñez Jiménez before he passed away. So an older man, African-Cuban, who I know very well, and he and I went to this event, just wandering through and talking to people. But I say there were people there who had obviously come together and with a purpose, but there are people who just went the same way you would choose to go to an important moment in your country's history. The next morning was the beginning of the procession. That's Ulises Aquino, the head of Opera de la Calle. Ulises, again, is a very old friend. As anybody who knows Cuba will tell you, Ulises is not exactly shy in his criticisms of the system or of the leaders. He walks a very complicated line in which he's an opera singer and a producer who has a lot of liberty in the way he talks about things, and is now upgrading his theater so that the next time you go, you'll be able to enjoy Opera de la Calle in a very much better environment. Anyway, Ulises and I went there. Now, Ulises was a bit more cynical about why people were there. He said, well, first of all, there are people, this was at the corner of Paseo, right near the Ministry of Culture, and that people had come because it was expected of them. And I'm sure there were people for whom that was the case, but there also were just lots of people, families and individuals of all kinds of different ages. So this, basically everybody's lined up to wait for the cortege to come. Fidel was immediately cremated and his remains were in a small box, and he was in the back of on a wagon pulled by a jeep with military people sitting in it, and that's what went through the country. And this is what happened every place. People turned out because for them it was important. Before the cortege arrived, there was a helicopter that made sure that, because there were important people in the cortege. Now, for me the other place I wanted to be was Santiago. Getting from Havana to Santiago is not easy. It's a 14-hour bus ride, and in my case, the bus departed 3 hours late. So, but this is the Via Azul terminal in Havana. In Santiago, which was I saw the beginning and the end, and then when I went to Cienfuegos afterwards, I talked to friends in Cienfuegos about it, and there's a very interesting story out of that. But at any rate, this is Santiago. To the right is where Fidel gave the speech about "We've won." This is the Plaza Jose Marti, and so it was just jammed. And again, different kinds of, occasionally, not always, but occasionally, especially older people would react with grief, very obvious grief. Let's say there, you also did see that people had come with their school groups. So the last part of the event, the final stage, was a mass event in Santiago. Important historically for Cuba, for the United States. This is near the Maceo Memorial in Santiago. Again, I mean, you should look at the crowds. And I think Brian's right about the complications of race in Cuba, but look at the crowds and see who's there. Santiago is the blackest part of Cuba, so not surprisingly. Again, all over the place in terms of age. And there's some people who stayed overnight. The ashes were taken the next morning to, I've heard different descriptions. It's a big boulder with a hole in it, and it's already a major tourist attraction. By that morning, after the ceremonies had finished, it had become a tourist attraction of Cubans, and I think eventually of international visitors also. One of the things, last things I want to talk, one of the, is that the constant theme that one heard was people chanting, "Yo soy Fidel." And when I asked what "Yo soy Fidel" meant, the answer was usually something about this sense that he was the person who gave us our identity as Cubans. He was the person at his best who we wanted to use as a model. And I think that's a real part of it. Again, it's within the context of controlled media and everything else, but also within the context of 50 years of threat. When a country is threatened, the people who head that country are either thrown out immediately or they become the symbols of national resistance. So the other thing, the Cienfuegos story, a friend of mine is the head of UNIAC, the Union of Writers and Artists in Cienfuegos. He's an expert about the Amistad slave rebellion ship. He actually was a technical advisor to the film. He has an ongoing dialogue with dissidents in Cienfuegos. They came to him. Again, this is somebody I know, so I feel confident what he's saying. They came to him and said, look, we would like to be part of this when the cortege passes through Cienfuegos. But we're afraid, because everybody knows who we are, as far as being dissidents, as opponents, we're afraid that if we go, that people are going to be angry at us and they're going to think we're there to protest. Could you help us? And he did, and they went. And, you know, again, the question was the position that he characterized them taking as Fidel was a national revolutionary. We're there for him as a figure of the country, not as a communist. So, I mean, it's a very, very complicated, nuanced thing that I think all I can say is take advantage of those $250 round trips and go and talk to people yourself. And I think we're actually going to turn out to be okay with Donald Trump. On Cuba, anyway. I don't know about the rest of the world, but on Cuba, I think we'll be okay.
All right, so now we will take your comments or questions if you have any for our panelists today.
When you said that in Cienfuegos, the leader of the head of the union, writers union, helped make it possible for the dissidents to attend, how did he do that?
He basically told whatever channel it was that he put the word out that these people were there because they sincerely wanted to be there. I didn't ask him the mechanics of it. I mean, it may be, I mean, what basically he said to me, they didn't need to worry. So it may have been that he simply reassured them and they went and they didn't have any problems. So Cienfuegos, I discovered, was the one place there was a popular uprising against Batista, and they actually took the city with, of course, tremendous death afterwards when Batista took it over again. So I learned something. Each trip I learned something more.
Another question? Yes.
Mr. DePalma,
Could you please identify yourself?
Yes.
Your affiliation?
I'm saying, Mr. DePalma.
Yes.
My name is Marta House. I'm just interested, and I'm not a very knowledgeable person about Cuba or any international affairs anyway. I'm a social worker for trade. And, but my understanding as a Colombian and as a United States citizen for 37 years is that Cuba did not develop the last 60 years in a vacuum. It was not in isolation. So I didn't see much of a judgment that you made of Cuba refer to the forces outside Cuba that needed to be considered. I'm wondering why that is.
Well, I'm not sure what forces you're talking about, but
You want me to tell you?
yes, I do, but when, I cannot be at a public forum and allow anyone, with all due respect, to make a comparison between Abraham Lincoln and Fidel Castro and not object to it. So just on the record, let me object to in any way comparing the two. And also, my name is Anthony, not Brian.
Yeah,
Sorry.
But-
I was gonna tell you that.
But please, you mean
He's a
the United
movie star.
States embargo?
Well, it's more than that. In a way, it's that, but it's also the power of Russia and how the Cuban people seem to have been forced to choose
Yeah.
somebody to align with, which may have, in my opinion, forced a communist state where Fidel was never a communist. I do believe that Che Guevara was a communist. He believed in communism, but not Fidel.
Well-
Fidel had a different type of mentality.
Yeah, I mean, those are very complex issues. I think for the purposes of this discussion, the best way I could answer that is to say that those outside influences did shape Cuba in an unnatural way. First it was the United States, then first it was Spain, then the United States, then the Soviet Union, now Venezuela, and what comes next. I think all of those things kept Cuba from essentially standing on its own feet. For all that Fidel talked about an independent and sovereign Cuba, he did not produce one. It was a Cuba that was artificial, it was on artificial life support. And my closing remark was addressed at that, because it may now, without Castro, and certainly next year when the Castro era we think will come to an end, then they will begin to learn what it really is like. So you can't have an education system like they have if you have to pay for it all yourself. You can't do the things that they did without the $1 billion a day that came in from the Soviet Union during those special years. Now they would not be able to go a few days without the oil that comes from Venezuela that they can then resell and use on their own. So those outside influences Cuba has always had outside influences. It was one of the first colonies, it was one of the last, and then it almost immediately came under the influence of the United States, and then the Soviet Union, and then Venezuela. So my hope is that now finally, as difficult as it will be, there may actually be some independent Cuba without those outside influences that allow the people of Cuba to decide what they want for themselves. And I agree with you that they didn't elect any of these guys. They never had any kind of an election that said, yes, this is what we want, this is the system we want, these are the people we want. They haven't had that chance. There are elections, I guess we're just beginning another election cycle, but it's not elections the way we know elections, nor the way you know elections in Colombia.
Yes, go ahead.
You should do that
Over there?
outside.
Yes. Yes, do. Yes.
Hello, this is directed to Mr. DePalma. My name is Laura Kaplan. I'm a student here at the Graduate Center. And I almost, following up on the previous question, I was surprised by your lack of context in your description of Cuba, of outside influences, namely the U.S. embargo's effect on the conditions of scarcity in the country. And there are many outside forces, but namely the U.S. has been hell-bent on destroying the revolution ever since Castro came to power and declared, even he had tried to approach Nixon to become a natural ally with the United States, but he was rebuffed. And that is in part why he had to go to the Soviet Union and Cuba had to become communist. But anyway, without going to those historical I was surprised, and you said that he got the country to accept scarcity. But I would say a context is not a comparison with Cuba and the United States, but a comparison with the rest of Latin America. And I think Cubans know very well that their choice could be the system that they have in place, or they could be like a Guatemala, or they could be like a Honduras. These are the real choices that Cuba has. Yes. So I'm surprised you didn't include that context in your
Any other question, or would you like to respond to that?
No?
Okay.
Fair.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, I felt that somebody listening to you who had no context would just put Castro in the same category as Batista and Somoza and all the rest, Pinochet, and he's very different than these people. I agree, he's far from perfect, but your characterization, in my opinion, I wouldn't know the difference between him and Batista. It sounded like they were just as bad as each other.
Well, the government, it's very interesting. The Cuban government did not broadcast Mr. Trump's statements in the first day or two after Fidel's death. And they have been very careful ever since then not to take a position about him, not to create an obstacle. The more knowledgeable Cubans that I talk to, it's funny, there are some, there's a sort of Marxism that says that he's a capitalist, of course he's gonna want to end the embargo. He's a hotel constructor, of course he wants to have a Trump hotel in Havana or Varadero or wherever. So there's a certain level of, including from some fairly sophisticated Cubans who believe that he's going to do things that others wouldn't have done. There also, the official statements, Josefina Vidal made a statement last week, which is the first sort of official roundup of reaction. And what basically she's saying is, of course, we want to discuss with him, we want to talk about whatever it is that's on his mind, but he has to understand that our sovereignty, it's the same issue it's always been. If you took him literally, he would be basically going back to the old line of, we won't deal with Cuba until it becomes what we want it to be. And Josefina is saying, forget that, we're happy to talk to you. And it's clear that one of the flux points that interests Trump's people is the question of compensation. So who knows what actually, and Trump's language from the beginning was, the only problem with what Obama did was I could have made a better deal. Now, what does that deal mean? And are the Cubans clever enough to make Trump think he's getting a better deal when it's sort of the briar patch? They give the Brer Rabbit and the briar patch. They're giving him what they wanted to do anyway. For instance, opening up cuenta propistas to everything except blocked categories, or moving forward on the small and medium enterprise stuff that came out of the party Congress and didn't get much further in the assembly meeting. So there's, they will in principle never say that they're giving in to pressure, because that's what's kept them independent for 50 plus years, is that. And the Vietnamese had the same attitude. Till they got normalization, the end of the embargo, the Vietnamese language was equally harsh about the US. But the moment they had it, we couldn't be better friends, thanks in part to China, but that's another
Thank you.
factor.
Thank you. Let's move to the next question, please.
All right. My name is Roseanne Larissa. I just retired as the writing specialist for Florida Coastal School of Law in Florida. And
Can you speak up a little bit?
Yes, of course. I went to Cuba. I spent last December there. I went in saying Castro. I came out saying Fidel. And I think that the people of Cuba, without being an expert or having done any fact checks or any research on it, genuinely loved Fidel and some of the things he did. One specific thing I noticed was that the women seemed to have the children they wanted, not the children they could not avoid having. I don't know I'm sure that the birth control policy in Cuba must be very much in favor of women having control of their own bodies. And that's something that I think is huge in any society in this day and age. We're in a very advanced country, and that is something that is at risk at this moment.
It is at risk, very unfortunately. I don't know if you'd like to make a comment.
Oh, you have
Yes.
one more from the.
Oh, okay. What? Yes, over here. Yes. Go ahead.
My name is Andrea. I work here at the Graduate Center. I just returned from Cuba on Saturday, so I hadn't known about this, but again, thank you, Mauricio and others for this wonderful talk. I went with someone who was studying to be a doctor in Puerto Rico in 1959, and she had been to Cuba in 1959. I had been there before in 1989, when the Soviets were still there, and then again in 1992. So we each came with our different perspectives, but we all had and different memories of what Cuba had been. It was incredibly different than any time that any of us had been there before. But as always, we were incredibly inspired and awed by the wisdom and strength of the Cuban people. And that's what we really came away with. We had numerous, I'm constantly talking to people when I travel, and in Cuba it's incredibly easy. Cubans love to talk to you, and they love to listen to you, and it's delightful as a tourist. So I had many conversations with Cubans, and they were just so smart, so informed, so opinionated, so wise and cautious and hopeful about their own future, but not at all, in my opinion, many people, all different kinds of people, not at all naive about Trump or, it was very hard. It was very hard to be this time, and I think they're very concerned about their own future, clearly, and what this could mean. Confused, as all of us are, just because we don't know what the future will bring. But I just wanted to mention that, tourism was like out of control almost, but, Cubans are incredibly positive and hopeful, and I think everyone's just hoping that it moves in a positive direction and doesn't change their country so that it's unrecognizable.
Thank you. Any other question or comment? Yes, in the back.
Yeah, do we have any, I understand that the statistics about economics in Cuba is a very murky territory, but do we have any idea about inequality? I understand Cuba has not advanced its GDP as much as other countries which are not in isolation, but how about inequality in Cuba? Is there any such thing? What's the legacy economics-wise within Cuba's absolute measures?
Well,
let's not compare it to other countries, but
no,
within.
We have a very interesting panel coming up on Cuba's economy, correct, Mauricio Font? That's
16.
On the 16th of February. We are going to have an expert that lives here from Lehman College, but also an expert from Cuba, and Mauricio Font will be in the discussion.
Any previews?
The short answer is that there really not a whole lot of data, real hard data. There are perception studies, qualitative assessment, and some people would emphasize egalitarianism in the society, but also stark differences between white and black, people in the interior and people in Havana. We are looking at territorial differences, and they are pretty pronounced. Havana, Matanzas is one place. You could almost be in Miami, and then the rest of Cuba and the interior is a whole different place. So Havana gives you an impression. When you go to the interior, you may get a somewhat different impression.
So in other words, there may be something insidious in the structure of wealth distribution.
But it is an important topic, of course.
That once you open it up, it may actually amplify the inequality, that's all.
Well, the big problem is the relationship. What Obama did was open up the relationship between money from South Florida and people in Cuba. So if you have family in South Florida, that's investment capital for private restaurants, for a taxi, for a shoe shop or whatever. So, and most of Miami is white Cubans or lighter skinned Cubans. So there is a problem that's the consequence of the opening, and it's inescapable, I'm afraid.
All right, thank you. We had a question, you and over there, and then we're going to see how we're doing on time.
I have to ask my questions after that round.
Pardon?
I have to ask my question after that round.
Okay.
I'm Rose Perez. I teach social work at Fordham, and I have a human behavior class. And one of my students stumped me. I'm from Kauai 1, and so my student said, what can you do to help the people of Kauai 1? Because I understand it has not been as helped as Trinidad, or, and I see some heads nodding, or Varadero or other places. And that makes some of the people, who are from Kauai 1 very sad. Smells, it's just a lot of stuff. And yet there's wealthy families in Kauai 1. So I thought I would ask you the question about, are there any precedents of meso-level interventions, which would be at the community level, or is it strictly the way to help just one-on-one with remittances?
Well, in recent years, the Catholic Church has reestablished itself, and Caritas, the International Catholic Services, is actually fairly well established now in Cuba, in the Diocese of Havana and in the other places. And they have a broad range of assistance programs that are available to any Cuban, not just Catholics. And as you know, there are many Cubans who are not Catholic. So they are now providing that kind of assistance. So I assume if you're talking about that kind of help, helping Caritas would indirectly help the people there. That's one I know for sure that's established and operating.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, my name is Belmont Freeman. I'm an architect here in New York. I teach at Columbia University also. I do a lot of back and forth to Cuba, a lot on architectural topics on which I write. And I was going to respond to this gentleman's question back here about inequality in Cuba. And I've been quite astonished in recent years, and particularly accelerating in the last 2 years.
Can you speak up?
The appearance of a new moneyed class in Cuba, people who have good connections to the government, people who have access to investment funds from Florida that are now freely flowing to the island thanks to Obama's innovations. And I go to clubs and expensive restaurants in Havana, and they're full of Cubans who are paying with tips, driving fancy cars. I have a friend, an architect, who works for the Ministry of Culture, but he has a very good moonlight business renovating houses in Playa and Miramar for newly, ascendant Cubans who have money that I don't know where they get all the money, but it's happening very, very fast. It's impressive.
And it's not just Miami. I mean, Spain is also a source of a lot of funds. People have Spanish relative. Spain, if you have a Spanish relative, you could get a visa a long time ago. It's not just the money coming in from the States, which is important. The remittance is important, but also the government's willingness or inability to stop this capitalism from coming in. I mean, that's the tension in the party. The people who say, yes, it's necessary, we have to have it, and the hardliners who are saying, wait a minute, what kind of socialism is it if you have a restaurant, not paladar? I don't even use paladar anymore because it's outdated. They're restaurants. A white tablecloth restaurant called Elite in Miramar. What could be more of a contradiction than that? So the one thing I did want to point out, though, is one fact that I do know in terms of the quality. The difference in health statistics between black Cubans and white Cubans is almost no difference. So they are able to have access. The medical system doesn't provide great hospital care, but what it does, and there are Cuban doctors in Chicago, I think they were there just last week, they may still be there, who are showing the urban doctors how their system works in terms of having doctors in the neighborhoods, going out to the individual houses, checking with people on a regular basis, and doing the preventative kind of medicine that can enable you to have that kind of inequality among the racial groups that we certainly don't have here in the States, spending a lot more money. So I knew from the beginning that not everybody was going to agree with me. I didn't want to get into the embargo because I figured all you folks know about that. And it is a certain way to get the debate off in a whole other direction. So forgive me for that, and your comments and yours are certainly valid and welcome. I just point out that it's an embargo, not a blockade, and so that means the United States doesn't trade, but Canada, Spain, and everybody else does.
Professor Ford, would you like to give us some closing remarks,
Does
maybe?
you know what's likely to happen to remittances under Trump? Have you heard anything?
Well, there was an interview with Andy. Yeah, there's an interview with Andy Gomez, who is somebody of the Miami right-wing community, and he basically says everything's going. Remittances are going to worse than under Bush. Travel is going to worse than under Bush. I mean, it's, so.
What do you mean, he's going to abolish current policies?
Essentially, yeah. He's basically, Andy is saying that it's all going back to.
Going back to previous policies.
Tight control.
Yeah, from the US. People see what they want to see, and wishful thinking. I mean, Anthony, excuse me.
He looks like a movie
Anthony's
star.
completely right that you could talk about Claver Carone and several other people, and all of the old guard from the Bush administration basically came up with their list of things that they wanted Trump to do, but
Inside.
A lot of them, they were wrong about the wet foot dry foot. They had all other kinds of scenarios. And they didn't say that Obama was just one day going to end it. So no one knows.
And the wet foot, dry foot is important because, according to Mimi Whitfield, the Miami Herald reporter, who's really good, she said that the Obama administration checked with the Trump people before they announced the end of wet foot, dry foot, which had been in the works for months apparently, and there were lots of things that had to be negotiated. And you'll note that Trump has not said a word about it. So, that was, you want to take that one for us, that's just fine. So it's
So my question, my comment is really about the reform process. I mean, the Cubans themselves, Raul, and many others, then many people in the US have agreed, and you have, both of you, the economy is really has not been well for quite a while. Last year was negative growth. This year is going to be at least, in the most optimistic scenario, official one, 2% or less. It's not a whole lot, very likely to be less. So Cuba could be said to be hovering in a recession, right? I think these are the words from Cuba itself. And so there's there's a consensus on people, many younger people and economists and others concerned with this issue, that in order to develop faster, Cuba would have to reform itself, the economy would have to reform, more market, more liberalization, more this, more that. Raul, of course, started that process in 2006, slowly, 2008, a bit faster, and then 2011 with the six party Congress of the Communist Party of Cuba. Now, considering that in the past, if you look at the revolution and its history, the shift toward the hardline came from Fidel. Fidel was the hardliner, but most people. Raúl was either absent or agreeing with Fidel.
Cleaning up the mess.
Or cleaning up the mess. Considering that Fidel was the main architect of the shifts to the more fundamentalist version of socialism, and considering that part of his legacy,
Can you close
and
up
I
to
agree with both of you, his legacy can be argued forever. There are many, we don't have time to do it full justice, but there are two aspects of it. One, Fidel was the main architect of Cuban state socialism, meaning highly centralized version of socialism that exists in Cuba even today. And he was also the architect of a hard version of a nationalism directed at the US. Now, both of these legacies of Fidel are now under threat because of the proximity with the US. And what that would mean is likely to mean. And the question is, well, Raúl has more leeway to move to accelerate the reform process now that Fidel is gone, or not? Will he step on the accelerator? Now, you mentioned, one of you, that Raúl is tired. I heard that from many other people. Would Raúl really have, at this point in history in his life, the force to implement change in Cuba as part of this? So the question is, where is the reform process going? Again, that's a topic we're going to be addressing in our next meeting. You're all welcome. We have people from Cuba, we have people from the US.
Just to point out, everybody here must already know that Raúl has said that in February of next year, he will step down as the president. He'll continue as the leader of the party, but he'll be 86 going on 87 years old. When Fidel dropped out in 2006, he was 79, right? So he's up there. At the last Congress, they said that this would be the last Congress controlled by los heroicos, the Granma generation. So the next generation is not to be named. They're already in place. They're already making some decisions, and those are some of them are people who are not named Castro. Some of them are, and all of them are people who did not fight in the Sierra. And they have, I think, a different view. Last April, during the last Congress, the heroicos were still there, right? They were still there, and in fact, they brought Fidel out to sort of make sure everybody remembered that he was still there. But that's going to change, and so I think if there's going to be a change, it will happen with Miguel Diaz-Canel and some of the others who are not. The economy is still a mess. There's still shortages everywhere. There isn't a Fidel who's going to be able to say, look, let's work together and sacrifice and we'll overcome this. As you have rising expectations with those people in the restaurants and the people in the cars and the people who are making the tips, there are now cab drivers and tourist guides who have enough kooks and dollars to buy their own apartments, which they are now putting on Airbnb and renting out. Well, their expectation is rising. There's nobody there, as Araceli points out, to take over Fidel's place as an ideological leader in Latin America, more in Cuba. So I think those people will feel pressure, certainly, to produce results the way it happens in almost every other country. I mean, the leaders are there as long as they produce results and the people are behind them. So I think there's a generational shift that is likely to bring changes whatever Trump does, because they can trade with everybody else.
I want to end with two anecdotes, stories from Santiago. One is of the last formal event I told you about who spoke in Havana. The people who spoke in Santiago were representatives of mass organizations, the Women's Union, the agricultural organizations, all kinds of the sort of understructure that most Americans have no appreciation of, the role that it plays in Cuban society. And it's in part where that next generation is coming from. Raul spoke at the end. I mean, there weren't people from the government, there weren't people from ministries, there weren't people from the party. There weren't even Santiago officials. It was, or military people. And Raul spoke last, and he was, you know, he had spent the last 2 weeks, 9 days of grieving, traveling throughout the country. He was obviously tired. It was a very low-key speech, emphasizing the fact that Fidel did not want to be the object of a cult of personality. I mean, it seems contradictory. There's not to be statues, and there's not to be any, at the same time, you read the Cuban press and you still see articles about we have to learn from Fidel. So I think there's a contradictory, what is he going to mean in the long term? The other is a more personal thing. I stayed in a Casa Particular for the second time in Santiago, where the owner is a black woman in her mid-30s. She's married to an Italian who was obviously the source of the capital for this Casa Particular, and they have couple of three kids. And I always have my best conversations with her just before I'm leaving. And she says, well, I asked her, so how do you react to what's going on? And she said, I'm afraid. What are you afraid of? Well, Fidel was so important. Fidel is what held the country together. Fidel is what protected us from people from outside. I don't know what things will be like when you visit again. People are aware of all of these, the tensions, the economic contradictions, you talk to, one of the consequences of all of the private restaurants and the tourists is that food prices escalate and things become less available because the party has not yet been willing to open up the agricultural sector the way the Vietnamese opened up the agricultural sector. So, and people will complain mightily about that. And how those things get resolved, again, I think it does, though the Cubans would never, ever, ever, ever acknowledge that anything depends upon the United States. In fact, if Trump goes to the right on Cuba, then Cuba will go to the right, in a sense, internally. It won't change. If Trump, for whatever reasons, opens the door further, then I think the Cubans will move much faster, further. I had two announcements. Should I make them now, or do it at the end? Okay, well, one is, if people know Ruth Bahar,
yes, professor of sociology.
She is doing a program in Cuba in early March on the Jewish connections. Part of that is an opera that Opera de la Calle is doing called Hatwe, that was based on a Yiddish poem that was written by a Ukrainian Jew who came to Cuba in the 1920s, 1930s. Anybody wants to know more about that, I'm happy to tell you. The other is the New York Times travel show, is Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. We have Enrique Nunez, who is one of the Nueva Trova founders, is going to be talking about the private cultural program that he does in Havana. Two friends from Cienfuegos are going to be talking about the private things that they do with people visiting. We have a way of getting you free admission to the show, so just give me your card or your email address and I'll get you that information.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. And please visit Bildner.org for future events. As we said, we have one on the economy coming on February 16. Thank you.